So let us start. Thank you very much, Kiel, for just taking up with me tonight, or tonight in German time it is. Kiel Brennan-Marquez, I'm not going to introduce him. We all know how to use the internet and to do multitasking, etc. But I would just like to point out that Kiel has a special relationship with Frankfurt because it's going to be a guest professor here in Frankfurt. So for anyone who's in particular interested in the topics that he will cover tonight, feel free to meet up with him when he is in Frankfurt, get in touch with him and make him feel welcome here in Frankfurt, that there are lots of people who are interested what his research is on. Having said that, just the usual things. We'll have Kiel talk for about 40 minutes or 45 minutes. Unfortunately, we don't have a student tonight to comment on him, so if you need to take another 5 minutes, feel free to do that. And after your lecture, we will then enter into a discussion. Everybody can feel free to either raise their hand electronically, but you can also put questions to me in the chat as a private message or as a message to everyone in the chat, and then I will read them out or call on you, whatever. Some I know are sometimes on trains, etc., and have difficulty using this. So that's the organizational stuff. And with that, Kiel, I'm very happy, very eager to learn more. You go ahead.
Great, thank you. And just for my kind of timing purposes, how long total do we have? Is it 90 minutes or 2 hours?
We usually say that it's 1.5 hours, so 7:30. Okay. And sometimes if questions arise and the discussion is very strong and our speakers are willing to, then we continue for another 15 minutes or so.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just want to be mindful. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A. So I'll
exactly.
keep an eye on the time. Okay, great. So yeah, thanks Indra, thanks everyone for joining for this. I'm gonna indulge or maybe I should say ask for a bit of goodwill on all of your ends tonight, because I'm going to be talking about a project that I'm very much midstream on. So I have a couple of papers along the lines that I'm going to be discussing this evening, but I'm also, I just decided relatively recently, I just received tenure and decided that this is going to be the first book project that I pursue post tenure. And so to say that it's a work in progress is, you know, people say that a lot, but in this case, it genuinely is. And I really am looking forward to any and all feedback. It will be incorporated and I will credit you accordingly, I promise. So what I wanted to talk about today is a question that I've been puzzling over for a few years now about what aspects of human judgment, what we have traditionally entrusted in terms of controversial interpretive tasks that have been entrusted to humans, what aspect of those tasks, if any, are likely to forever defy full automation? So as we move toward a world in which machines, as we all know, are becoming more and more powerful, there's larger and larger data sets to work with, surveillance capitalism and its attendant institutional structures will presumably only continue to proliferate, and the information processing technology, what we now think of as machine learning systems, but what will soon become some form of specific or general artificial intelligence, is sort of right around the corner, historically speaking. You put all of that together, and there's increasingly a sense that many controversial interpretive tasks that we have traditionally entrusted to humans are going to be equally, if not better, performed in some important respects by machines. So machines are becoming powerful enough that they, in some ways, already can, and in other domains, may soon be able to outperform human experts in the relevant field. So just to use a concrete example, from the criminal justice world, which is where I kind of normally live as a scholar and teacher, we now have recidivism risk algorithms that judges can use to try to predict the level of riskiness or dangerousness of a convicted person at the sentencing phase or an arrested person at the pretrial phase, and they perform much, much better than judges have historically. They have lots of other problems. There's an ongoing conversation these days about what it would mean to ensure that machine decision-making is debiased, what it would mean to ensure that it's fair and neutral, what it would mean to ensure that it's relying only on truly reliable and unbiased data in the first instance. There's lots of important conversations going on, and I have been part of them to some extent, and I'd be happy to sort of talk more about them in Q&A. But for me, the kind of focal point of, or the big puzzle at the heart of this is, what about human judgment do we think may ultimately prove irreplaceable? Is there anything? So let me just give one more example we can put on the table, and I'll get into some details later on. Another example, not from the criminal justice world, so not quite as normatively controversial, but definitely giving rise to similar patterns of conversation, is we now have medical robots of various kinds that are capable of performing certain kinds of medical procedures as well as their human counterparts. So certain kinds of simple surgeries, for instance, say a broken ankle or another kind of simple joint that requires a surgery that's fairly superficial and just requires technical work with a bone structure. So it doesn't require, for instance, navigating around internal organs or anything like that. That is now at the point where we haven't really seen it necessarily rolled out in all medical systems globally, and because it's still being kind of subject, rightly I think, to regulatory oversight, but that at a technical level, that stuff is now an area in which machines are as capable, if not more capable, in terms of just minimizing errors at a statistical level than their human counterparts, and that the trend is increasingly in this direction. So especially when it comes to complicated and high-risk surgeries like brain surgery and other things that again require sort of complex navigation of the internal organ system of the body and whatnot. This is a realm where lots of people who are working in this area, and it's an area where there's been a lot of investment in powerful machines because it's so profitable and so important, where a lot of the experts believe that within the decade, basically, we will see machines that are capable, kind of smart surgery machines that are capable of, again, equally, if not, better performance relative to their human counterparts, and that the trend line is really dramatically in favor of machines. So all domains in this kind of conversation are going to look a little bit different. I'm not trying to say the criminal justice realm is the same as the medical realm, and there's sub-distinctions within them, and we can talk about other realms as well. But you see the point, and hopefully some of this is just familiar in the sense that you've read about it, even if kind of machine governance isn't your area of specialization, in that we seem to be moving toward this world where machines are going to be the better choice for lots of, again, kind of controversial interpretive tasks that we've traditionally entrusted to humans. So this, for me, raises the question, or what I called a minute ago, the big puzzle for me is, what about controversial interpretive tasks seems to require some form of human input, even under conditions where machines become extremely capable in terms of executing input-output functions. So being able to sense the world and understand at the input level what data they're working with, whether because they have a training set or because they have actual robotic optics and other kinds of artificial versions of a sensory system that a human would have, whatever all the inputs are, then the machine can take it and apply a complex bundle of functions and come out with outputs that we as humans who are designing these things find desirable. So the machine looks like it's doing the task correctly rather than incorrectly, and indeed doing the task more correctly on the whole than the human experts who have been training their whole lives and practicing to do it. So what is it about these tasks that might, in the end, still necessitate some amount of human oversight? Or what is it that human judgment adds to the equation in the last analysis? And so what I'm going to talk about tonight is the idea that the thing that human judgment adds to the analysis, the best way of understanding it, because I think it's a fairly widespread intuition that it adds something. And the question is, what is the something? The the best way of understanding it is that it bears on what we might call the preconditions of judgment, or the stage, the interpretive stage that happens before one actually engages in the controversial interpretive task, and that have to do with whether the person who is called on to engage in that interpretive task has determined for themselves that they have adequate standing, or that they have sort of an adequate basis as a moral and political subject to be the one who gets to perform the interpretive task. So it's about distributed authority and the kind of the meta decision, so to speak, that an actor who's called on to perform an interpretive task has to make about their own relatively distributed authority vis-a-vis other potential sources of authority, and that it's that question. So answering the question, if we boil it down to a very kind of commonsensical form, the question would be not what is the right judgment here, but who am I to judge? Am I the right person to judge? Or is the body that I make up and I represent the right body to judge? Or, you know, you can imagine variations on the question, but boiled down, it's the distinction between what is the right judgment on the merits. That's the question that I think the conversation has mostly been focused on, but that the place where human judgment is going to prove essential and irreplaceable is actually with regard to a different question, which is who am I to judge as a moral and political agent? Why me rather than somebody else, or maybe nobody at all? Okay, so that's the kind of claim that I'm going to explore, and I'll do so in sort of two parts. Like if this were a paper, this would be where, you know, at the end of the introduction, you see the little roadmap. So part one will be sort of about what is the difference between the question of judgment on the merits versus the question of who am I to judge, the distributive authority question. What do I mean in distinguishing those two as categories of question or question types? And then the second part will be having unpacked and hopefully persuaded you that there's something to that basic dichotomy, explaining why I think it is that machines are going to be kind of incapable in principle of performing the who am I to judge function adequately, even if they are equally capable, if not more capable than humans, at actually exercising judgment on the merits, or actually carrying out what we've thought of as the traditional interpretive task. Okay, so when we think about this idea of who am I to judge, the analogy or the kind of paradigmatic canonical example from Western thought that comes to mind for me is a parable from the Gospel of John. This parable, you're probably familiar with in one form or another, at least you've sort of heard about it in a colloquial way, or at any rate, it's true in the United States. I'm not sure if it's as true there, but I'm imagining that it is. So this comes from chapter 8 of the Gospel of John, and it's the parable about people declining to cast their stones at a sinner who has been condemned to death in the town square. So basically what happens in the parable is there's a sinner, an adulteress, so somebody who's been sort of convicted, would be our kind of contemporary language, convicted of adultery, is drawn up in the town square and has been condemned to death on the basis of this sin. And so Christ at this point has become a controversial political figure in his own world. And he has a lot of enemies who are resistant to his basic theological kind of message. And the enemies say, okay, we're going to try to basically trip Christ up in his own theology, because his whole thing is don't judge, forgiveness, this is a fleeting world, and among humans, we really can't sort of assert power over one another. That's something to be left to the divine, and I'm the divine messenger explaining the cosmic hierarchy to you. So this has upset a lot of political authorities, to put it mildly, right? And so they say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take Christ to the town square where the adulteress is, the person who's been convicted of adultery. And we're going to say to him, okay, what are we supposed to do here? This person has been convicted. Adultery is a sin. It's against our laws. What should happen? What is the sort of Christian answer? Or what is your answer? This was before we had Christianity as an institution. What is your answer as a kind of prophet or supposed prophet to this circumstance? So Christ thinks for a minute, and he looks around, and this is the famous part of the story that folks are probably familiar with. he looks around at all the other people who have gathered around the town square, and he says, who among you has never sinned before? Let him cast the first stone. So he looks out over everyone, he says, who can sort of introspectively determine that they have sufficient standing as a moral and political agent, as a member of the same person's community, moral community, to stand in judgment, and in particular to become the kind of seat of the executioner? Who feels confident enough? And again, this is the famous part of the parable. Everyone decides that they're going to put down their stones, and they walk away. And then Christ says, well, having watched this whole thing unfold, I too determine that mercy is warranted, divine mercy is warranted, and that the sinner should go free. Okay, so what's interesting to me about this parallel, in the sense in which I think it forms a foundation of common sense everyday morality, and also an important aspect of humane legal and moral institutions in the world, is that in the moment where Christ is asking the observers, the onlookers, to decide whether they have sufficiently sort of clean moral status in the world that they can cast stones, that what Christ is asking is this question that I was talking about a moment ago as, who am I to judge? Or what he's prompting the onlookers to ask of themselves is, who am I to judge? As distinct from what the right judgment is or would be if I am properly in the seat of judgment. So he does not say, for example, look at all these mitigating circumstances that make it so this person, despite having committed adultery, looks less culpable or blameworthy. He does not make a plea for mercy. Nor does he say, wait a second, if we understand better what happened in the case of this actual adulteress, when we look in the particulars of it, like if you were sitting on a jury, or we had to see it play out in a work of literature, we might see that actually this wasn't adultery at all, that it was a mistake of fact, or it was duress, or it was adultery necessary under conditions of deep social and political compromise, war, or something like this. And that when we see it in that light, we see that not only does the person maybe deserve mercy, but there's an argument that they didn't even actually commit the offense once the offense has been jurisprudentially sort of shorn up in a more sophisticated way. That in our legal system is a move not toward mercy, but toward equity. The idea that we need to be able to adjust on a particular basis what the actual content of criminal offenses or of rules are. So we have these two grand ideas of lenience that have sort of structured a lot of Western legal thinking for a long time. One being sometimes, punishment is warranted, but we have independent reasons for forbearance. That's mercy. And the other time, and the other idea being, sometimes it looks like punishment is warranted, but when we start to really zero in on what happened on the particulars, we see in a kind of Aristotelian spirit that in fact, on the particulars, punishment is not warranted, that this thing that happened has something in common with or bears a family resemblance to the thing that we have condemned or that the rule system says is wrong, but it's not really that thing. And so it's not just that forbearance is permissible or compulsory, but that in fact no punishment is warranted at all. Christ is not telling the onlookers to do either of those functions. Those are the functions that we associate with lenience in our actually existing legal institutions in the 19th century and beyond. He's not asking for that. What he's saying is, forget the merits. We might have other things to say about the merits. If you decide that you are prepared to cast a stone, I might, as the adulteress's lawyer, be able to give you reasons why you shouldn't still. But before we even get there, think for yourself about your own moral standing, about your own moral and political subjectivity as a member And in kind of democratic terms, we might say co-equal member of a community as this person who's subject to the possibility of punishment, and ask whether you feel licensed to exercise judgment in the first instance. And that's where the onlookers put down their stones. So it seems to me that that question is, again, sort of profoundly important to our everyday sense of moral selfhood. And we see this play out in our lives all the time, often in small ways. It's often not dramatic stakes, like you're being asked to stone somebody to death or anything so dramatic, anything equivalent. It's small things. When do we let people off the hook? When do we decide, or in what sense do we decide that we are not going to cast judgment or cast aspersion on those around us in our neighborhoods and in our families and among our colleagues and so on and so forth? We don't always say that we're not going to cast aspersion. In fact, on the contrary, humans tend to be quite judgmental, maybe for good. But the idea that we have to sort of be performing this distinctive kind of intellectual labor as a legitimating condition of the exercise of judgment, I think verges on reflexive in our everyday lives. And in our institutional world, we can see it picked up as a theme as well. So I think, and one of the things I've explored in previous work is the idea that understanding why the jury trial as a kind of instrument of folk morality matters to the legitimacy of the criminal justice system, like why we wouldn't just want to hand everything over to technocratic judges or other kind of bureaucrats to administer punishment. That one account of that, and maybe the best account of that, is that it's picking up on some version of this, that we believe that the jury is distinctively capable of asking themselves under the right conditions, at least in the outlier cases, maybe not that often, in other words, but sort of it's always possible that they will say, wait a second, we just don't feel like we can judge or we should judge. Forget what judgment we would render. Okay, so that's the basic sort of conceptual structure of what I mean. And again, I think for those of you who are interested in legal and jurisprudential theory, I think one way to kind of understand how the who am I to judge set of concepts plays out as opposed to the what is the right judgment set of concepts is to think about the distinction between the decision not to cast a stone or declining to cast a stone or exercising a certain kind of there before the grace of God go I humility in the face of the possibility of judgment. That's on the who am I to judge side, versus equity and mercy in some combination, which has long been thought, going back to Rome and Roman law, to be a central ingredient to a basically kind of civilized and humane legal system. And I agree with that. I think equity and mercy are really important. We don't want a system that just kind of relentlessly enforces rules to their letter. In fact, that's a dystopian trope for the most part. But in addition to having these kind of parameters on the exercise of judgment that go to the content of judgment, that tell us what the right answer is in particular cases, when forbearance is warranted, when in fact, when you look at something more closely on its particulars, it doesn't really look like the culpable thing anymore at all. That whole set of questions is different from this other question that goes again to the standing of, or the kind of political moral subjectivity of the person who is being charged with the possibility of judgment, rather than what the actual outcome of judgment should be. Okay, so that's the basic idea conceptually here. Let me say a few words about why I think it's plausible to believe that machines will be sort of incapable of satisfyingly answering the who am I to judge question, even if they're really good at the other kind of question. So here the basic idea is that to answer the who am I to judge question in a satisfying way, the agent who's tasked with answering the question needs to stand in a position of reciprocal vulnerability with the party who's being affected by the answer to the question. Or to put it slightly differently, as I did in a recent paper, there has to be a dynamic of role reversibility between the party being asked to exercise judgment and the party who would be affected by the judgment. Often adversely will be the situations that we care most about. But I think it's actually generalizes beyond that. It could be for windfalls. It could be for positive, or sort of salutary judgments as well. But role reversibility is the key. And the reason why is because for the agent asked to perform a judgment to really decide that the answer to the question, who am I to judge, is yes, or is some version of I am the right person to judge, that agent has to be able to go through a series of thought processes that requires an imaginative engagement with what happened for the affected party in the past. And in particular, the agent has to be able to ask at a minimum, would I have acted the same in the shoes of the affected party, assuming that what they've been accused of is true, or assuming that they did as they have been accused of doing. And that set of questions that relates to the moral concept of hypocrisy, but I think can be shown up in other ways as well, is central to the integrity of asking the who am I to judge question in the right way. So in other words, we would want a person charged with the exercise of judgment over others, or judgment in a way that's going to affect the fate of another person, to be able to say, am I confident that I would not have done the same? Am I confident? Can I really say that I feel the license that comes from being able to assure myself, albeit counterfactually, because I wasn't in the position, but can I really sort of proceed on the assumption confidently that I wouldn't have acted just as they did? This is exactly what Christ calls the onlooker's attention to, as in terms of the way he describes the analytic operation that he's prompting. As a precondition of judgment, it focuses on the past acts of the onlookers. Have you sinned before? Let he among you who is without sin cast the first stone. And that for that to be possible, there needs to be a kind of co-equality of communal membership. There needs to be some shared moral community. It can be thin, but it has to exist as between the person exercising, or the agent called on to exercise judgment, and the one who would be affected by the judgment. And that seems to me the necessary ingredient, that it's plausible to think that machines will not be able to readily reproduce. Now, I say this with a major and really important caveat, which is that the claim depends on an idea of membership in a moral community that is itself complicated and controversial. This is why I need to work out in the book. It also depends on the supposition that machines, even when they are very sort of powerful implementers or instruments of input-output functional decisions, or controversial interpretive tasks, that they are not members, that they sort of don't qualify as being members of the moral community in the relevant way. I'm not going to try here. I mean, I'm happy to talk about in Q&A if people are interested. I'm not going to try in the course of the rest of my remarks here to defend or sort of build out the account of what I mean in the abstract or in concept by membership in a moral community. What I will say about the notion that machines are sort of prima facie, it doesn't seem like they would be members of the moral community, or sort of a shared moral world, in a way that this role reversibility depends on, which ultimately informs the who am I to judge question. What I will say is that I'm open to the possibility. In fact, I enthusiastically embrace the possibility that we could eventually come to social conditions, social and technological conditions in which machines were members of our moral community. And in that world, it's perfectly possible that they could perform the intellectual labor required to answer this question just as well as other humans who may be kind of remote from me, but are nevertheless a member of my moral community in the relevant sense, is able to perform it. It's just that the question is not one of how good is the machine at doing the interpretive work. It's instead the question of what the scope of membership in a moral community is and whether and in what sense it includes machines. And it also invites possibilities like if you had a robot on trial, you'd want to have robots on the jury. Or if you had some kind of complex interaction between humans and machines at issue as a matter of what's being judged, you would want that to be reflected in the apparatus or the set of people or agents that is engaged in the process of judgment itself. So the point is about a symmetry that again sort of depends on a conception of what it means to be a member of the same moral community, but that the point is about symmetry, and it's not supposed to be an impossibility proof. Like if you buy this, then we could just never have machines be engaged in these important functions. It would just be a claim about what we should ask to decide whether the legitimating conditions have been satisfied. And that what we should ask is just by category, not how powerful is this machine? That's just not the right question for answering what the scope of machine authority to engage in judgment or to be installed in positions of judgment should be. That's an important question in its own right. And it may be an independent reason, if we are skeptical that machines really will become so powerful or really at present are so powerful, that might be an independent reason to be skeptical of their rightful role in a lot of these decision-making processes. And that is something that has been, is being actively discussed. So when I said at the outset here, it looks like machine learning is doing pretty well and we're going to have artificial intelligence and so on, there's plenty of people who are skeptical of that and who say things like, yeah, the machine might be able to repair a few broken ankles, but it's like nowhere near brain surgery, and it's nowhere near complicated interpretive medical tasks. And it's machines might be better at predicting risk than judges because judges are basically throwing darts at a blind board. But that's not that impressive. Machines aren't actually that good. So that too is something that I don't necessarily have any stake in. My point is simply that even if machines became powerful enough that they would be able to capably perform or outperform humans on the dimensions of what the actual correct judgment is with respect to certain interpretive tasks, that would not be enough to confer to them the authority to claim the mantle. So that's another way at some broad level, and I'll end it once I sort of zoom out here and we can open it up to Q&A. But at a broad level, another way to think about this project is that I'm trying to distinguish or insist on a distinction, which I think is core to political theory, but is getting lost in some of the machine governance debates, between capability on the one hand and authority on the other hand. So there's a lot of discussion about how capable machines actually are and how capable we can expect them to evolve to become in the near future, or the sort of short, medium, and long term. And that involves a number of different sort of cross-cutting concerns about what we mean by successful interpretation, about what kinds of input data and other sort of technological inputs and technological characteristics the machines are relying on, and whether there might be something kind of fundamentally concerning or unfair bias about those implements. There's a whole bunch of really interesting and important work being done on the question of machine capability, but that strikes me as sort of different by category from the question of machine authority. And to have an account of machine authority, I think we need to be able to talk, at least if we're broadly speaking trying to work from a democratic political theory foundation, we need to be able to talk about sort of shared membership in the same moral community. And that I think these questions about the preconditions of judgment, but asking whether one is sufficiently positioned or is kind of in an authoritative position vis-a-vis the task of judgment, as opposed to what the sort of answer should be, is a way of getting at this. We see this show up in the legal system too. Again, I think it's probably a little bit different in the German system, but in the US system, we see this show up in the distinction between the merits of a legal question versus things like jurisdiction and other sort of prerequisites. There's an idea, even institutionally, that there are some things where, sure, if I as the judge, or I as the court, or I as the jury, or I as the prosecutor, whatever, could look at this, I could exercise judgment about it. I have an opinion, maybe a really sophisticated one. Maybe I'm right. Maybe I'm more likely to be right even than the people who are going to ultimately get to make the decision. But that's different from the question of whether I'm in the right position to be sort of proceeding forth with the enterprise of judgment in the first instance. And it seems to me that that's where machines are likely to continue to disappoint, or to continue to provoke a set of intuitions that I think we should take seriously and try to theorize about why there's something kind of fundamentally concerning or uncanny about the idea that machines, however powerful, would be in charge of shaping our fates. Okay, so I'm going to end there and we'll open it up to Q&A.
Great, thanks a lot, Kiel. That was very, very challenging because it was super theoretical on the one hand, but at the other hand, you raised questions of utmost, I think, legal problems which we encounter every day. And also, I like the distinction between what you called authority and capability, because I would completely agree that we're talking a lot about capability. And I think one of the reasons we're doing that is that we lawyers tend to think, okay, if machines are not so good after all, then we don't have to think about the questions behind that. And that's basically the question of machine and human being interaction. Where is the machine overtaking the human being, and where would we not accept a machine decision? But I'll stop here.